On June 29, 1994, Prince Charles appeared on national television and admitted to adultery. That same evening, Princess Diana walked into the Serpentine Gallery in a black, off-the-shoulder Christina Stambolian dress that showed more skin than any royal had ever shown in public. Every newspaper in the world ran her photograph on the front page. Charles's confession was buried on page 7. This was not a coincidence. This was not spontaneous. This was planned, and I'm going to show you exactly how. But first, you need to understand the operation that was already underway. Not Diana's, Charles's. Because what most people forget, or never knew, is that June 29th was supposed to be Charles's night. He'd been planning it for over a year. He'd invested enormous political capital, personal vulnerability, and the credibility of his entire household into a single, high-stakes media gambit. And by the time he sat down in front of the cameras with Jonathan Dimbleby, Charles believed he was executing the most important public relations maneuver of his life. He was right about that, just not in the way he expected. To understand why Charles agreed to strip himself bare on national television, you have to understand just how bad things had gotten. By early 1993, the Prince of Wales was arguably the most humiliated man in Britain. Not disliked, not controversial. Humiliated. And the humiliation had a very specific, very public origin. In January 1993, Australian magazine New Idea and then British tabloids published transcripts of an intercepted telephone call between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, recorded in 1989. The press called it Camillagate. The conversation was intimate, sexually explicit, and it contained a single exchange so mortifying that it essentially defined Charles's public image for the next decade. The heir to the throne told his mistress he wanted to be reincarnated as her tampon. Those were, more or less, his words, printed in full, in every newspaper in the country. Try to imagine being Charles in that moment. You are the future King of England. Your face is on stamps. You are, by constitutional design, the embodiment of national dignity. And 30 million people have just read a transcript of you making tampon jokes to your girlfriend while your wife sleeps down the hall. The damage was thermonuclear. Polls showed Charles's approval ratings cratering. Public sympathy, already shifting toward Diana after the separation announcement in December 1992, lurched decisively in her direction. Charles wasn't just losing the PR war, he was being annihilated in it. Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story, had detonated in 1992 and given Diana's version of events to millions of readers, painting Charles as cold, neglectful, unfaithful from nearly the start. Charles had stayed silent. The Camillagate tapes made silence impossible. He needed a response, a big one, something that could rewrite the entire narrative. Enter Richard Aylard. Aylard was Charles's private secretary, his chief of staff essentially, and he'd become convinced that the only path forward was radical transparency. Not a press release, not a carefully worded statement through Buckingham Palace, something far more ambitious. A definitive, long-form, deeply personal documentary that would show the British public who Charles really was. The real Charles. Not the tabloid villain, not the tampon caller, not the cold husband. The full human being. Aylard found his vehicle in Jonathan Dimbleby, a broadcaster with serious credentials and a reputation for rigorous, sympathetic, long-form journalism. This wasn't a tabloid hack. This wasn't a royal correspondent fishing for gossip. Dimbleby was establishment media at its most respectable, and Aylard believed, with what turned out to be catastrophic miscalculation, that Dimbleby's gravitas would lend the project an authority that tabloid coverage could never achieve. The access Aylard granted was unprecedented. Dimbleby got Charles's private papers, his personal correspondence, extended on-camera interviews conducted over months, access to his staff, his schedule, his daily life. He accompanied Charles on official visits. He sat with him at Highgrove. The resulting documentary, Charles, the Private Man, the Public Role, would run 2.5 hours on ITV. 2.5 hours. That's not a news segment. That's a feature film. Eilard wasn't building a rebuttal. He was building a monument. And the thing is, the monument had a lot of genuinely compelling material in it. The documentary covered Charles's difficult relationship with his father, Prince Philip, whose parenting style Charles had experienced as cold and demanding. It explored his miserable years at Gordonstown, the Scottish boarding school Philip had insisted upon and Charles had hated, a place where the future king was bullied and lonely and desperately unhappy. It showed his passion for architecture, his environmental advocacy years before it was fashionable, his organic farming at Highgrove, his charitable work through the Prince's Trust with disadvantaged young people. It presented a portrait of a thoughtful, complicated, often lonely man trapped inside an institution that didn't know what to do with his sensitivity. Genuinely good television, genuinely humanizing, and absolutely, comprehensively irrelevant to what happened next. Because Eilard had made a calculation, and the calculation was this. If the documentary was going to address Charles's life honestly, it had to address the affair. The Humiliated tapes were public. The Morton book was public. Denial wasn't just unconvincing, it was laughable. Eilard believed that a direct, honest acknowledgement of infidelity, placed within the context of a 2.5-hour humanizing portrait, would earn Charles respect for his candor. The British public, Eilard reasoned, could forgive a man who told the truth. What they couldn't forgive was a man who lied while the evidence was sitting in every newspaper archive in the country. There was a logic to it. A clean, reasonable, disastrously wrong logic. What Eilard understood was the value of honesty in the abstract. What he didn't understand was the news cycle. Specifically, he didn't understand that the news cycle is a machine that reduces 2.5 hours of nuance into 4 seconds of spectacle, and that the 4 seconds the machine would select were already obvious to anyone who'd spent 10 minutes in a tabloid newsroom. Dimbleby asked Charles directly whether he'd been faithful to Diana. Charles paused, then said he had been, but only until the marriage had irretrievably broken down. That pause, that careful, lawyered, agonized qualifier. It was supposed to be nuanced. It was supposed to communicate complexity. Yes, there had been infidelity, but only after the marriage was effectively over, and context mattered, and the full story was more complicated than any headline could convey. What it actually communicated, in the 4-second clip that would be replayed 10,000 times, was, "The Prince of Wales just admitted to adultery on national television." Everything else? The 2 hours and 26 minutes of humanizing, contextualizing, painstakingly constructed rehabilitation evaporated. Eilard had built a cathedral. The press stripped it for 1 brick. In the days before June 29th, the advance publicity confirmed that Eilard's worst-case scenario was already unfolding in real time. ITV released clips, newspapers published previews. Every outlet in the country ran the same story. Charles is going to confess. The environmental advocacy, the Prince's Trust work, the painful boarding school memories, the complicated relationship with Philip. None of it generated a single column inch of advance coverage. The infidelity angle consumed all the oxygen. And Charles's camp watched, increasingly desperate, as a year of strategic planning collapsed into a single talking point they couldn't spin, couldn't contextualize, and couldn't control. But they still had hope. Misplaced, fragile, doomed hope. They believed the documentary itself, the full program, all 150 minutes, would shift the conversation once people actually watched it. They believed the confession clip was a bump they could absorb, not a bomb they couldn't survive. On the morning of June 29th, Charles's household was in final preparation mode, briefing sympathetic journalists, reviewing post-broadcast talking points, monitoring ITV's schedule. Nobody in St. James's Palace was thinking about Diana. Why would they? The documentary was the story. Charles's confession was the story. Diana was irrelevant to their operation. This blind spot was fatal. Because someone else had been watching the advance coverage, and she'd already started planning. Diana's counter-operation began, as near as can be reconstructed, roughly 48 hours before the broadcast. The Serpentine Gallery, that elegant modernist exhibition space inside Kensington Gardens, practically in Diana's back garden, given her residence at Kensington Palace, was hosting a major fundraising dinner on the evening of June 29th. Vanity Fair was sponsoring, which meant international press coverage wasn't just likely. It was architecturally guaranteed. Photographers, wire services, arrival shots filed to picture desks worldwide. Diana had been invited. She'd said no. The refusal made sense. By mid-1994, she'd been pulling back from public life. She'd given her Time and Space speech in December 1993, reducing her official duties. She was navigating a separation announced in December 1992 that remained legally unresolved. She had every reason to skip a society gala. She did skip it. She declined. Then the advance press coverage about Charles's confession started building, and Diana reversed her decision. Accepted with roughly 2 days to spare. 48 hours. Not an impulse. A planning window. And this is where the story transforms from reactive defiance into something far more calculated. Because the dress Diana chose that evening was not new, was not purchased in haste, and was not the outfit she'd originally planned to wear. The designer was Christina Stambolian, a Greek-born, London-based couturier who'd been making clothes for Diana. In September 1991, nearly 3 full years before the gala, Diana had commissioned this dress at a cost of roughly £900. Black silk crepe, asymmetric off-the-shoulder neckline, ruched and fitted bodice, pleated chiffon skirt falling above the knee with a short train at the back. By the standards of royal dressing, it was frankly explosive. Diana had never worn it. She'd judged it too daring. The color, black, was reserved for mourning in royal protocol, not cocktail parties. The neckline exposed collarbone and décolletage in a way senior royals didn't do. The hemline was above the knee. The fit was body-conscious to the point of being unapologetically sexy. She'd kept this dress for 1,000 days, waiting. And here's the detail that shatters any notion of spontaneity. On the evening of June 29th, Diana had originally planned to wear a Valentino outfit. Safe, appropriate, forgettable. At the last stage, she switched. Valentino went back. Stambolian came out. That swap is the most consequential wardrobe change in modern public life. Name one that comes close. Choosing Valentino would have meant Diana attended a gala. Choosing Stambolian meant she detonated it. Think about what Charles's team was doing at this exact moment. Final preparations, last-minute briefings, monitoring the broadcast, probably, if we're honest, feeling cautiously optimistic that the full program would do what the advance clips hadn't. Nobody in St. James's Palace was gaming out the possibility that Diana might deploy a visual so powerful it would make their documentary irrelevant before the closing credits rolled. And nobody was thinking about color symbolism. But they should have been. On the night her estranged husband publicly acknowledged the death of their marriage's fidelity, Diana dressed in the color of mourning. She mourned his betrayal in a dress that made her look more alive, more powerful, more desirable than she'd ever appeared in public. The visual metaphor wrote itself. In the harsh light of press flash guns, which wash out pastels but make black fabric look rich and dramatic, the dress was practically engineered for front-page reproduction. Diana didn't improvise this. She had infrastructure. Her private secretary, Patrick Jepson, was a former Royal Navy officer who'd served her since 1988. Jepson understood media dynamics with a precision unusual in royal circles. He later described Diana not as a woman buffeted by events, but as someone who learned, adapted, and mastered the media machinery that the rest of the royal family treated with suspicion. Whether Jepson was consulted directly on the dress isn't definitively established, but his role as her principal strategic advisor makes it extremely likely that the broader counter-programming, accepting the invitation, understanding the press dynamics, bore his fingerprints. She also had Anna Harvey, deputy editor of British Vogue, as an informal fashion advisor. Harvey understood the semiotics of royal dressing, how a hemline or color choice communicates volumes in a photograph. Beyond them, the hairdressers and makeup artists summoned to Kensington Palace that evening. The pearl and sapphire choker selected for the throat, every element calibrated for photographic impact. No detail accidental, every detail lethal. Charles had Aylard and Dimbleby and a year of documentary footage. Diana had a dress, a choker, and 15 seconds. It wasn't a fair fight. The Serpentine Gallery that evening was crawling with press, not just because of the Vanity Fair sponsorship, but because of the documentary itself. With ITV broadcasting the confession simultaneously, editors had dispatched photographers to cover every angle of the royal story that night. Diana's attendance at a gala, while her husband confessed, was, in news terms, an irresistible parallel narrative. Charles's operation was providing air support for hers. She pulled up in the early evening, stepped out, cameras erupted. One leg extended, black dress catching the light, her expression not wounded but composed, almost serene. A woman arriving at a party, not fleeing a crisis. The choker glinting, bare shoulders. The asymmetric neckline creating a dynamic diagonal across every frame. 15 seconds. Every photographer in the press pen knew instantly they were shooting the front page. Inside, Lord Palumbo, chairman of the Serpentine, hosted. Diana stayed the full evening. She smiled, she talked. She appeared radiant, composed, in control. Not a woman in crisis. And this composure was itself a weapon, because it refused to give anyone the narrative of a wounded wife collapsing under the weight of her husband's confession. The story wasn't sadness. The story was power. So where was Charles? While Diana was dazzling a room in Kensington Gardens, roughly 20 million viewers were watching the documentary on ITV. Charles himself had retreated from the public stage for the evening. This was, after all, meant to be the documentary's night, and the convention was to let the broadcast speak for itself. He wasn't making appearances. He wasn't counter-programming. His team's entire strategy depended on the idea that the documentary was the main event, and that once 20 million people had seen the full 2.5 hours, the boarding school misery, the environmental passion, the charitable work, the honest acknowledgement of failure, the conversation would shift in Charles's favor. They had no contingency plan. None. In military terms, they'd drawn up an elaborate offensive campaign and given zero thought to defense. The possibility that someone might launch a counterattack, let alone a counterattack so devastating it would obliterate their primary objective, simply hadn't occurred to them. This is the asymmetry that defines the entire evening. Charles brought a 2.5-hour documentary to a photo fight. Then morning came, and the scoreboard was brutal. June 30th, 1994. The Sun, the Daily Mirror, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, every single one led with Diana. Her photograph, large, luminous, impossible to ignore, dominated every front page. Charles's unprecedented televised confession of adultery, the single most significant royal admission since the abdication crisis? Inside pages. Buried. Not the lead, not even close. The mechanism is almost painfully simple once you see it. A televised confession is a narrative event. It requires context, quotation, analysis, column inches to convey. A photograph of Diana in that dress is an image event. It requires only a front page and a caption. Editors making layout decisions at midnight on June 29th had two stories, one that needed explanation, one that needed only a photograph. The photograph won. It always wins. And Diana had engineered a structural advantage so overwhelming that no picture editor in Fleet Street could justify burying her inside the paper. Not when the image looked like that. That's not emotion. That's architecture. For Charles, the morning of June 30th must have been sickening. Not because Diana looked beautiful. He'd seen her look beautiful for 13 years. But because his team had just watched a year of meticulous strategic planning, months of unprecedented access, a 2.5-hour documentary designed to rehabilitate his entire public image, get neutralized by a woman in a cocktail dress in under 15 seconds. The documentary wasn't just overshadowed. It was erased from the conversation. Nobody was talking about Charles's passion for organic farming. Nobody was discussing his complicated relationship with Prince Philip or his lonely years at Gordonston. Nobody cared about the prince's trust. The only thing anyone was talking about was Diana's dress. The internal atmosphere at St. James's Palace that day was, by all available accounts, devastated. Aylard had staked his professional reputation on the documentary strategy. He'd argued for the confession. He'd believed in the healing power of honesty. And he'd been proven spectacularly wrong. Not because the honesty failed on its own terms, but because he'd failed to account for the existence of a counter-operative who understood the media better than he did, and who had used his own publicity machine against him. Aylard's position became untenable. Not immediately. These things move slowly in royal households, where loyalty and discretion are valued above competence. But the Dimbleby documentary's failure accelerated a loss of confidence that couldn't be reversed. The strategy of radical transparency was quietly abandoned. The idea that Charles could win the PR war through direct engagement with the media died on June 30th, 1994, face down on page 7. Aylard would leave Charles's service within 2 years. His departure was the final casualty of an operation that had been outmaneuvered before it even began. And the consequences cascaded outward. The confession didn't just embarrass Charles. It gave the palace a problem it hadn't anticipated. The Queen had reportedly watched the documentary. The explicit on-camera acknowledgement of adultery, whatever Charles's careful qualifying language about the marriage having irretrievably broken down, created a formal, public, undeniable record. You can deny rumors. You can't deny something the man said on camera to 20 million witnesses. By December 1995, the Queen would write to both Charles and Diana, advising them to divorce. The letter was extraordinary. The sovereign, as head of the Church of England, actively encouraging the dissolution of her son's marriage. Multiple factors drove that decision. But the Dimbleby confession had made the situation unsustainable. Charles had gone on television and said the quiet part loud. There was no putting it back in the box. And Diana? She'd made sure nobody was even looking at the box. This wasn't a one-off, either. Diana had been developing this capability for years, and Charles's camp had consistently failed to see it coming. She'd secretly collaborated with Andrew Morton on Diana, Her True Story in 1992, feeding her narrative to millions of readers through a controlled channel while maintaining plausible deniability. Charles's team found out too late. She'd tipped off photographers to her location on multiple occasions, ensuring she was captured in sympathetic settings, visiting hospitals, comforting AIDS patients, holding children, while Charles was photographed looking stiff at formal functions. She understood, with a sophistication that nobody in his orbit could match, that the camera was the battlefield and the front page was the scoreboard. Less than 18 months after the Serpentine Gala, in November 1995, she'd sit down with Martin Bashir for the Panorama interview and deliver the single most devastating line in royal media history. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. Again, Charles's side was blindsided. Again, no counter-strategy. Again, Diana chose the timing, the venue, the framing, and Charles was left reacting instead of acting. The pattern is damning. Every time Charles's team launched an offensive, the Dimbleby documentary, the authorized biography that accompanied it, Diana had a response that was faster, sharper, and more mediagenic. She understood something the palace never grasped. In the war between narrative and image, image wins. In the war between the institution and the individual wins. If she's willing to break rules, the institution can't. Charles, constrained by protocol, by advisors who thought in paragraphs when the public thought in photographs, by the sheer institutional weight of being the heir to the throne, he could never match her speed. He was playing chess, she was playing the cameras. Different game entirely. And the thing that should haunt Aylard, the thing that should keep every strategist who studies this case up at night, is how little Diana actually needed. Charles had the resources of the monarchy behind him. Dimbleby, ITV, 2.5 hours of prime-time airtime, a year of planning, a staff of dozens. Diana had 48 hours, a dress she'd bought 3 years earlier for £900, and an instinct for the camera that nobody taught her and nobody could replicate. The asymmetry isn't just embarrassing, it's instructive. She didn't outspend him, she didn't outwork him, she outthought him. Which brings us to the name everyone knows, the revenge dress. It entered the fashion lexicon and never left. Every time a celebrity wears something spectacular after a public breakup, commentators invoke it. Diana didn't just win a news cycle, she created an entire cultural archetype. But here's my problem with the term. Revenge is emotional, impulsive, reactive. It implies a woman lashing out, driven by hurt. And that framing, however sympathetic, diminishes what actually happened. It also, quietly, lets Charles off the hook. If Diana was just being emotional, then Charles was simply unlucky. He happened to confess on a night his ex-wife was feeling dramatic. Poor timing, bad luck, could have happened to anyone. That's not what happened, not even close. What happened was premeditated. Diana had days of lead time. She reversed a declined invitation. She bypassed a safe Valentino for a weapon she'd been storing since September 1991. She chose the highest visibility venue on the highest visibility night of the year, walked into an amplified press environment that Charles's own documentary had created, and delivered a visual so powerful it knocked a royal adultery confession off every front page in the country. Charles brought a documentary. Diana brought a photograph. The photograph won. It was always going to win. That's not revenge. That's a counter-offensive executed with surgical precision against a target that didn't even know it was under attack. And it remains the single most successful act of media warfare by an individual against an institution in modern history. Charles had the palace, the broadcaster, the biographer, and the full machinery of the heir apparent's office. Diana had a black dress and a car pulling up to a gallery in Kensington Gardens. And she won so completely that 30 years later, People remember the dress, but have to be reminded about the documentary. Everyone remembers the dress. Almost nobody talks about the strategy. And that, when you think about it, is the real genius. Because the best operations are the ones nobody realizes were operations at all. Charles certainly didn't. Not until he opened the papers the next morning and found himself on page 7. Subscribe for more stories like this.